All right, class, welcome back to our conclusions video. It's been however long for you, it's been literally seconds for me as I'm recording this all in basically a single sitting. So conclusions, the end you've made your points, you've told your story, you're at the end of your essay. What now do? Well, if you think back to the things you were told in high school, it is partially correct. So it's been the case where it's like, okay, I'm going to conclude. First sentence of my conclusion should be a restatement of my thesis statement. Then I reiterate the points I made in my essay, and then I'm done. Well, a couple things. Your conclusion doesn't necessarily need to start with a restatement of your thesis statement, although that can be a good signal to your reader that you are concluding. Like I mentioned in the past video, in the previous video, in the introductions one, sometimes you are writing to your professor in that they have particular pet peeves that you've got to figure out and don't do those things. I will be absolutely open with you about this. Please do not start your conclusion with, in conclusion. I can see it's your conclusion. I can see it's the last paragraph. You don't have to signal it to me like that. Do literally anything else. If you have to write it because that's how you draft, fine, but then cut it out later. But your conclusion is going to serve that reminder function still, at least a little bit, at least in part, that is what your conclusion's doing. As we've seen, I argued for why Frankenstein is so boring because of A, B, and C, or as we've seen, my first Crohn's flare-up was a difficult experience, and it taught me, whatever lesson it taught me, to value things while you've got them, while you can still eat fresh fruit. But your conclusion now has a second function. It's going to do more than just remind your reader of your main points. It should also leave your reader with more to think about. We call this sort of the so what question. All right, I read your essay about your first Crohn's disease flare-up and the lesson you learned about how to be happy with what you've got in the moment while you've got it. Why should I care? So what? So the conclusion is a place for you to recontextualize the lessons that you learned or the things that you talked about in order to give your reader some additional analysis or some additional things that they can go out into the world and do. So in a compare and contrast paper, you might suggest your reader think about comparing what you talked about to other things. So it's like, oh, I compared thing A with thing B, and now that you've seen how I did that, reader, go out and take thing A and compare it to things C, D, E, and F as well. So that kind of stuff. It brings what your story or your lessons or your point out into a broader context. So things you could do when you are concluding. One, you could offer some additional analysis. Any extra insights you have based on the topic of your essay. Certain lesson from the paper and offer them in different contexts. For example, if my paper was how I was forced to read Frankenstein and didn't like it, I might suggest what kind of story I would like to read instead, based on what I've learned that I don't like. Or I might suggest what would have made Frankenstein a less boring story. Or I might offer, like, okay, dear reader, you've seen everything that I've analyzed, and get them to think about what do you think? Here's what I think would have made it better. What do you think would have made it better? Basically, you are giving additional insight or analysis, and I know we haven't talked about what analysis is yet, but you're taking the lessons that you learned and you are taking them to other contexts in a way that didn't make sense for the body of the essay. So if I'm telling a story about my first Crohn's disease flare-up, it doesn't really make a lot of sense for me in the body of the essay to talk about how I plan on navigating life given my changing situation. That's a good thing to do in the conclusion, though. Just like, oh, now that I can't eat these foods, how am I going to, not starve? Well, do all this kind of stuff. You could speculate about the future. So, if you are telling me a narrative story where you were a different person before your story, and then your story happened, the events of your story happened, and you've changed, you've grown, you've learned things, and now you're a different person because of that, you could talk about how you think this is going to continue to help you grow in the future, or what you're going to go and do now because of the lessons you've learned or information you have. For example, I might reflect on what other horrible kinds of books I'd be forced to read after having been forced to read Frankenstein. Or I might speculate on how I'm going to make my way through life now that I'm less physically able because of Crohn's disease. Or if your story happened a long time ago, as mine did, my first Crohn's flare-up was in 2009, rather than speculating about the future, I might update my reader on what has happened in the intervening time. Let me tell you about the story of my first Crohn's flare-up in 2009, and in my conclusion, I'm going to tell you, okay, it's been 15 years since then. Here's how I've made it through life. So I'm taking that story and I'm bringing it into the context of the present. Close with a quotation. Again, all the same caveats as opening with a quotation that we saw in the introductions video. So cite your quote so your reader knows who said it. Make sure you actually say in there who said it. Quote should be relevant to what's being talked about, and the rest of your conclusion should address or respond to the quote in some way. Exact same caveats that you saw with using a quote in your introduction. Now, your response to the quote might be a little different because in the introduction, your reader has no context for what the rest of your story details are yet. They haven't read the rest of your essay. At the end of your essay, in your conclusion, they have, so maybe the way you respond to a quote can be different than if you had used it at the beginning. Just something to consider. Closing with a question. So if you ask a question at the end of your essay that cannot be answered by reading the paper itself, then you leave your reader thinking about what your story was, what your essay was, and that's stuck in their head. Like I said in the previous video, humans don't like unanswered questions. It's psychologically uncomfortable, so we tend to make things up. So for example, I might end my essay about being forced to read Frankenstein by asking my reader what their worst reading experience was. So that lets, I've told you the story about my worst reading experience. Reader, what was your worst reading experience? Was it better than mine? Was it worse than mine? And that leaves them, they put your essay down because they're done reading it, but now they're thinking about, what if they had to tell a similar story, what are the kinds of stuff that they might say? So closing with a question can be very powerful in giving your reader more to think about. Doesn't have to be something frivolous like my examples here. Like if you're arguing for a particular position, like certain environmental concerns, maybe you close with a question that leaves your reader thinking about like environmental damage that's being done. You're trying to get them to think about the position you're arguing for. So when you get to argument papers, it's still a strong way to end a conclusion. But again, it should be an open question that is not answered by the paper, that your reader, and it should not be a yes or no question. Your reader should have to actually think about whatever it is you ask them. And then you could call your readers to action. This gives your reader something they can actually go out and do in the world. So for example, I might suggest that if someone ever tells the person reading my paper that they should try reading Frankenstein, that my reader should tell that person no. Just say no. That always works. And that they should avoid that book at all costs. Or in my Crohn's disease hypothetical, my first Crohn's disease flare-up essay, I might tell my reader, go out and enjoy all the fresh fruits and vegetables that you can. Go out and go, get into running while you can. This stuff goes away, and it's a shame to not enjoy it while you've got it. Go eat an apple. I can't eat apples. So it's like, go do this. One, to enjoy it for yourself, but two, so I can vicariously live through all the people out there eating apples. So this is a very powerful thing to do. It's, closing with a question is a little like that. It's giving your reader mentally something to do, to think about. But giving your reader something they can actually go out and do in the world is a very strong way to end your paper. If you don't know what else to do, if you don't... this is a good default, let me put it that way. If you can't think of a way to conclude, think about what it is you can tell your reader to go out in the world and actually do now as a consequence of having read your work. Go vote on this. Go protest this. Go don't read Frankenstein. Go eat an apple. Whatever it is, big or small, giving your reader a call to action is a very strong way to conclusion. And if you don't know what else to do, it's a good default. to the point where it's kind of like it could be probably a preferred default. Like, well, I could do this other thing, but calling my reader to action, giving them like, hey, you've learned this lesson from me, go out and do this thing, is always going to be a great option. Alternatively, you can mirror whatever you do in your introductions. So if you opened with a quote, bring that quote back in the conclusion. Now your readers read your story, and that quote might look different. You could say something else about it now that your reader has all the information that they've got. If you asked a question in the introduction, you know, bring it into the conclusion and give your reader the answer you wanted them to have. So part of the problem with like asking an open-ended question is if you want your reader to have a particular takeaway or a particular answer to that question, you're going to have to provide it in some way. Open-ended questions, people go all kinds of different ways with them. Or if you like, what else? Lead with a quote. If you made a surprising statement in your introduction, you might bring it back in or into your conclusion and show that maybe it's not so surprising as people initially thought. Maybe, in fact, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein can eat my ass. And then that's basically it. So here's some extra notes. So this was all meant to be like one go through. So I am going to touch on introductions a little bit as well. So if you're unsure what to do with your conclusion after reiterating the ideas in your paper, call your readers to action. Very strong. There are more introduction and conclusion strategies that are covered here. I left some out because they're not always useful to every genre of paper that we're writing in this class, but just be aware, because we're not doing like historical analysis or statistical analysis or something like that, that there are other more specific introductory and concluding strategies. Again, if you can find a cheapo copy of Joining the Conversation, I recommend picking it up. That's where all these come from. And then finally, a big piece of advice for introductions. At the end of the conclusion video, yes, I know. It can be very useful to have your thesis statement as soon as possible so you know what is supposed to go into your paper or not. But it can be incredibly useful to write the rest of your introduction dead last, as it can be easier to introduce your paper once you know what it actually says. This is something that I do. It's something a lot of my colleagues do. Just even after the rest of my conclusion's written, only then will I go back and try and figure out what I want my introduction to say. It's very often the case in my classes that, when I give students in-class writing time, I'll go around the room, I'll check to see how people are doing, and they'll say, Mr. Shoemaker, I don't know how to start my paper. And I will ask, when you say you don't know how to start your paper, do you mean you don't know what to write for the first sentence of your introduction? And they just have a blank word processor in front of them, and they'll be like, yes, I don't know what I want my first sentence to be. And of course you don't. You don't know how to introduce your paper because you don't know what your paper says yet. Don't start at your introduction. You should not approach papers unless for some reason you're really inspired. It can be, let me rephrase, it can be incredibly difficult to approach a paper from the mindset of writing it in linear order, first sentence first, all the way to the next, to the next, to the next, to the last sentence last. Don't do that. Get yourself an outline so you know what you want to do in any particular paragraph, and then start at a random body paragraph. I've started papers where it's like, okay, I've got my thesis statement. I know the point I'm trying to make. I've got my outline. I know what I want to say in different paragraphs. I really feel like writing paragraph 4 first because that's what, that's in my mind right now. And then I'll write body paragraph 4 before I've written the 3 paragraphs that come before that. And if you have a good outline, you can do stuff like that. You can bounce around your paper and write the parts that are interesting to you at the time. It can be incredibly frustrating and difficult to try and start with the first sentence of your introduction. I say that as somebody who, I've got a master's in this. I've been doing this for years. That's still a rough way to try and start a paper. I don't even do that. And so I recommend that you don't do that either, and that you write your introduction absolutely last. I promise you, there's a good portion of you in class, I would guess the vast majority, who would find that suddenly easier. Now, in order to be able to do that, that involves having good pre-writing skills, that involves doing good brainstorming, having a strong outline, and then being able to know what's going to be in the body of your essay before you could start just writing random paragraphs in the middle of it. Outlining can be a very powerful tool that can help you get over that first hurdle of not knowing what to write for the first sentence of your essay, because you're not starting there, and you shouldn't start there. Please don't start there. You're literally just making things harder for yourself. Unless you've got an excellent first line bouncing around in your head, like, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein can eat my ass. That's a fun way to start a paper. But odds are it'll be a more frustrating experience if you try and write the first sentence of the essay as the first sentence you actually write. Skip it, skip the rest of the introduction, go to the rest of the paper, get your thesis statement nailed down, and then come back to the introduction absolutely last. And that's basically it for introductions and conclusions. We will see a bit in the example essay in a minute, and I will see you in that video shortly.